Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
Laws are being drafted and debated at the State House right now. Laws that will likely affect your everyday life as an Idahoan. The Connector helps you keep up with the legislative session with clear reporting, local context, and explanations that make it all make sense. Stay connected to the State House with the Connector, Idaho Daily News. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. America and Israel struck around Friday with planes and missiles, and President Donald Trump said the goal was to obliterate Iran's ability to produce long-range missiles. Bombs were also targeted at Iran's military structure. Now, Iran hit back with thousands of drones and missiles, which fell in Qatar, Dubai, Bahrain, Israel, and Iraq, as more nations were drawn into this conflict. One Idahoan, though, remembers a very different time in Iran before the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Michael Zorinsky is a history professor emeritus at Boise State. He lived in Tehran back in the 1950s, and he went to the American Presbyterian Missions Community School there as well. And he has written extensively about Iran's history and its role in World War I. He's joining us now live on the program to talk more about this. Welcome so much. We really appreciate your time today.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
So, Michael, tell us why you were in Iran back in 1956. My understanding is your father was posted there.
Right. My father was an attorney, a civilian working for the Corps of Engineers in New York. He was asked if he would like to go and be the attorney for the new district that was being established there. He said yes, and off we went.
So describe what Iran was like in the 5 years that you lived there.
Well, that's an interesting question, and I hope I can be succinct. Physically, it was much like southwestern Idaho, and coming from New York, this was quite a surprise, as it was when I landed in Boise to interview for the job that I had at Boise State. I walked off the plane and looked up at the mountains and said, "Oh my word, it looks like Tehran." But Tehran was a very different place from New York, and especially from the suburbs in which I lived. It was then a city of about 1.5 million. It had grown very rapidly, probably adding 1 million people since the end of World War II, so just in 11 years. And in the 5 years I was there, it grew to 2 million. And so it was, in many ways, a rough place. We lived in the northern suburbs, and there was a lot of empty ground between the city itself and where we lived. There were roads that were put out that I used to ride my bicycle on just to get some exercise. But the city itself was, how do I want to say this? It was under martial law. There were soldiers with fixed bayonets posted at many of the public buildings. It was a city in which I observed that people coming in from the countryside to try to find jobs at incredibly low wages, working as day laborers for something like 50 cents a day. People were sleeping on the streets. We would call them homeless today, but they were trying to make a better life for themselves compared to what life was like in the countryside. The rest of the country I didn't see very much of. Although when I was 15, I had a job with a road crew in the central part of the country. And the road that was being paved was to take goods from the Persian Gulf coast up to the city of Tehran. It was a road that had been built hastily during World War II by the American Army as a part of the route to send Lend-Lease supplies to the Soviet Union. Um, and what else can I say? It
Well, what I
was
wanted,
a,
what I
yes,
what I'd
go
like
on.
to what I'd like to do, if we could, because you described, I think, very well those 5 years that you lived there and what it felt like to you. Let's jump ahead 15 years because you went back to Iran in 1979. You went for a conference.
It
In
was
those
actually
18 years that you
1980s. It was
okay, so
I
in that time that you had been gone, had
right.
the country changed much? What was it like then when you go back in the late 70s?
Well, the first thing that struck me when I went back was that the city had grown up tremendously. The city of Tehran had grown from perhaps 2 million when I left to 10 million. The low-rise city that I knew had suddenly sprung up with hundreds, if not thousands, of high-rise buildings. The empty grounds were filled. But in many ways, it was much the same. We arrived in the middle of the night, were taken to where we were staying for the conference on what seemed at first to be a frightening ride. We were on a four-lane highway, or maybe it was six, half going north, half going south. The driver, who was a veteran of the Iran-Iraq War, pulled into the extreme left lane, which was where the opposite direction traffic was supposed to be going, accelerated up the mountain to 100 miles an hour. It was February. The heater was on in the carryall. It was a Toyota. The windows steamed up. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to drive, going to die. And then suddenly it hit me. This is how Iranians drove. This is where I learned to drive. And so, in a sense, although it was a different city, it was much the same. Other changes that I noticed, and real changes, in walking on the street. As a teenager, I was, more or less up to my um, full height of 5'7", 5'8", and I felt that I was towering over most of the people I saw on the street. In 1997, a new generation was walking the streets, and they were as tall or taller than I was. So clearly, there
Mm.
had been better nutrition as well as a lot more people surviving and growing up. And then as I looked around the city, I saw all the portraits of the Ayatollahs and thought, well, this is not really a change because in the old days it was the Shah's picture, but there was still this cult of personality that was being cultivated. So,
So you study
in
Iranian
result,
history.
pardon?
You study Iranian history. So
Yes.
especially Iran's role in World War One. So can you briefly tell it what is it about that time period in Iran's history that if at all plays into what is going on now?
Well, I think I have to back up a little bit, and I hope I don't take too much time with this. When I was in Tehran, I went to a school which had been established in the 1930s by Presbyterian missionaries who had been working in Iran since the 1830s. So for 100 years before they established this school, they homeschooled their children. And by the time I got there, it had become a full-fledged international school, very small, really. There were about 200 of us in the high school and another 200 in the elementary school, but we represented probably 30 different nationalities or more and all the
Mm.
religions of the world. And so it was not exactly an Iranian experience, but it was very much an American experience. And it set me on my course of research which I began really after I was at Boise State when the revolution broke out. I had this vague sense from having this high school experience that there was a time when America was in very good odor among the Iranians. and that this goodwill was created by the missionaries who, as I learned when I read their archives, went out to try to convert people to Calvinist Christianity, but in fact quickly understood that they were not going to be very successful at that in a country which regarded changing one's religion as like changing one's parents. And so they
Mm.
focused on good works, on education, and on medical assistance to people who needed it, hospitals and schools. And all of this was taking place at a time when European countries, particularly the Russians and the British, were engaged in serious imperial activities, taking provinces away from Iran and, in many respects, refusing to recognize their right to exist as a separate country. And all of this came to a head in the First World War when the Turks attacked the Russians via Iran. Iran at this time had no army except for a small group that had been established by the Russians as an imperial guard for the Shah. And so the fighting that took place in Iran was devastating. Iran could not defend itself. The armies went back and forth across the country. They certainly killed civilians, as happens often in wartime, but more
Hmm.
importantly, they exacerbated the famine that started shortly after the war began, and they spread epidemic diseases, as a result of which perhaps as much as 10 to 25% of the population died. By the end of the war in 1918, the Russians, the Germans, the Turks, empires had collapsed and only the British remained. The British regarded Iran as being, and this is a quote from the then minister, Sir Percy Cox, that Persia was an outstanding ulcer of chaos in the civilized world. And so what Britain wanted to do was to stabilize the country. And in practice, that would have resulted in creating the kind of protectorate that they exercised in Egypt, that they had established in India, that they had established in many of the Gulf territories, which are now oil producing and very wealthy countries. And the Iranians wouldn't have anything to do with it. Cox managed to negotiate a treaty by bribing the government. But when the word got out about the bribe, the treaty was a dead letter. And so when the British Army had to return to Britain because Britain was broke after the First World War, the people on the ground in Iran, British people, without reference to London, organized, or I should say, helped organize a coup d'etat that established the Shah's father, Reza Pahlavi, as dictator. And he worked his way up in the authority of the country, um, so much so that he gained a great deal of political support from all the independent groups, from merchants, from Islamic clergy, as well as educated Western style intellectuals. And he made himself king in 1926. Um, but he was a patriot. And so he was not necessarily going to do what the British wanted him to do. And by the 1930s, he was very much tilting towards Germany. And so when the Germans attacked the Soviet Union in 1941, the British conspired with Stalin to attack Iran and occupy it again. And so between 1941 and 1946, it was under Soviet and British rule. Um, and in 1942, the Americans came in to do lend-lease activities to the Soviets. And so there's this, I really want to say two things about it. First of all, the Americans began with a very good sense in Iranian feelings that Americans were well-meaning, were
Mhm.
wealthy, were capable of doing all kinds of wonderful things, and were not interested in taking over their country. And so
Mm.
the Americans were encouraged by the Iranian government during World War II to take a greater role in what was going on during the war. And after the war, uh, building on the goodwill that had been created by the missionaries, the Americans continued to be encouraged by the Iranians. All of this came crashing down with the 1951 to 1953 oil crisis, with the Iranian government was placed in the hands of a popular politician, notably uncorrupt in a country which had a long history of corruption. And he wished to nationalize the oil company that was controlled by the British, a concession that had been made before the war, which had become enormously profitable for the British, as well as important for the Royal Navy's uh, energy supply. And so the British refused to accept the nationalization. And at first, the Americans were supporting the Iranian government as they had supported the Iranian government against the Soviets in 1956. But by 1953, it became clear that uh, in the minds of the people who were running the Cold War in the West, that this was creating a situation which would eventually result in a Soviet takeover. That probably was nonsense, but
And
it
Michael,
was
I
the
am unfortunately going to have to end our conversation there. I really so appreciate your time. Would love to talk more about this. I think it's so critically important to for all of us to understand the history as you do and where we are today. We've been speaking with Michael Zorinsky. He is a history professor emeritus at Boise State. He writes about Iran's history in World War I, and he will be featured in the upcoming book, An American Educator in Iran, The Life and Times of Samuel Martin Jordan. You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudette.
Hi, it's Terry Gross, host of Fresh Air. Hey, take a break from the 24-hour news cycle with us and listen to long-form interviews with your favorite authors, actors, filmmakers, comedians, and musicians, the people making the art that nourishes us and speaks to our times. So listen to the Fresh Air podcast from NPR and WHYY.